Hello. Okay, this is a talk about how to spot a psychopath. The statistic, by the way, which Robert Hare, who invented the psychopath checklist, came up with, is that 1 in 100 people is a psychopath. So there's It's 100 people in the room. So one of you is a psychopath. Yeah, more than if psychopaths enjoy going to talks about psychopaths, there could be more than one of you in the audience. And I think psychopaths do enjoy going to talks about psychopaths because of item 2, grant your sense of self-worth. So 1 in 100 regular people is a psychopath, Hare says, but 4 in 100 CEOs are psychopaths. So you're 4 times more likely to be ruled by a psychopath than you are to have one as your subordinate. Okay, so I'm now a professionally trained, and I've got to say extremely adept, psychopath spotter. And I will tell you the story of how I became a psychopath spotter and what I did with my powers. It started, I was at a friend's house, and she had on a shelf a book called the DSM. Do people know the DSM? It's the Manual of Mental Disorders. And it used to be in the 50s, it was very slim. It was like a little pamphlet, but now it's an enormous book. They've come up with a huge number of mental disorders. There's 886 pages, 374 mental disorders. So I was leafing through the book and wondering if I had any mental disorders, and it turns out I've got 12. I've got generalized anxiety disorder, which is a given. I've got nightmare disorder, which is categorized if you have recurrent dreams of being pursued or declared a failure. And all my dreams involve somebody chasing me down the street going, "You're a failure." I've got malingering, and I think it's actually quite rare to have both malingering and generalized anxiety disorder because malingering tends to make me feel extremely anxious. And I have parent-child relational problems, which I blame my mother for. And I have caffeine-induced disorder, which I've got right now. So I was leafing through this book wondering, my goodness, am I crazier than I thought I was? Or maybe it's not a good idea to self-diagnose if you're not a trained professional. Or maybe the psychiatry industry has a strange fetish to diagnose normal behavior as a mental disorder. And I had no idea which was true. I was quite excited, by the way, to have so many mental disorders. It kind of made me feel like, it's good to know there's something wrong with you. And I wondered actually whether my anxiety was a good thing. Maybe it's a thing that drives me forward to achieve. Maybe it makes me do interesting things. Anyway, I was wondering, what is all this? So I thought it'd be interesting to meet a critic of psychiatry to get their view on it, which is how I ended up having lunch with the Scientologists, who have a crack team of psychiatry busters called the CCHR. So I said to them, can you prove to me that your thesis is right and that psychiatry is pseudoscience? They said, yes, you can. We can prove it to you. We can introduce you to Tony. So I said, who's Tony? And I said, Tony's in Broadmoor. Now, Broadmoor is Broadmoor Hospital, which used to be known as Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane. So I said, what did Tony do? And the Scientologist said, hardly anything. He's completely sane. He beat somebody up or something. He's totally sane. He faked madness to try and get out of a prison sentence. And he faked it too well, and now he's stuck at Broadmoor. And the more he tries to convince people he's sane, the more they take it as evidence that he's crazy. Do you want us to get you into Broadmoor to meet Tony? So I said, yes, please. So I went to Broadmoor. The Scientologist got me in. It's not easy. And we were sitting in the wellness centre. Brian, the Scientologist, said, by the way, Tony's the only person in the entire DSPD unit to have permission to meet people in the wellness centre. So I said, what does DSPD stand for? And he said, Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder. So I said, is Tony in the part of Broadmoor that houses the most dangerous people? And Brian said, yeah, isn't that crazy? So then the patients started drifting in, and most were overweight, and they were wearing sweatpants, and they looked quite docile. And then Brian said, there's Tony. And Tony came in. And he wasn't overweight. He was in extremely good shape. And he wasn't wearing sweatpants. He was wearing a pinstripe suit. And he was walking towards me with his arm outstretched like someone out of The Apprentice. Somebody wanted to convince me that he was very sane. So he sat down. And I said, was it true that you faked your way in here? And he said, yeah. He said, I beat someone up in Reading. I was on remand in my cell, and my cellmate said, you're looking at 5 years. What you need to do, fake madness. Tell him you're mad. You'll go to some cushy hospital, nurses will bring you pizzas, you'll have a PlayStation. So I said, so how did you fake madness? He said, well, I asked to see the prison psychiatrist. I'd just seen this film called Crash by David Cronenberg, in which people get sexual pleasure from enacting car crashes. So I told the psychiatrist, I get sexual pleasure from enacting car crashes. And I said, why? I said, oh yeah, I told the psychiatrist I like to watch women as they die because it would make me feel more normal. So I said, where'd you get that from? He said, oh, from biography of Ted Bundy that they had in the prison library. So he evidently faked madness much too well, and they sent him to Broadmoor, and he took one look at the place, said, there's been a terrible mistake. I'm not mad. I said, how long have you been here for? He said, well, if I'd just done my prison sentence, I'd have got 5 years. I've been in Broadmoor for 12 years. So for the last 12 years, he's trying to convince them that he's sane. I said, well, how do you do that? He said, well, it's not easy. I subscribe to New Scientist. I like to kind of, I try and talk to them about kind of normal things like football and so on. There was an article in New Scientist recently. They said that the US Army was training bumblebees to sniff out explosives. So I said to the nurse, did you know that the US Army is training bumblebees to sniff out explosives? He said later when he saw his case notes, they'd written, believes bees can sniff out explosives. He said, the more you try and act sane, the more crazy you seem. So Tony seemed completely sane to me, but I'm not a professional. But I left and I wondered what to do. So I decided to write to his clinician, Anthony Maiden. I said, well, what's the story? And his clinician emailed back and said, yeah, we accept that Tony's story is true. We accept that he faked madness to get out of a prison sentence because his delusions were very cliched. However, we've assessed him and we've decided that what he is a psychopath. And in fact, faking madness is exactly the kind of cunning and manipulative act of a psychopath. So faking your brain going wrong is evidence that your brain has gone wrong. He said it's on the checklist, cunning, manipulative. And I said, what else? He said, pinstripe suit, classic psychopath. That speaks to grandiose sense of self-worth and also glibness, superficial charm. Tony had told me that he didn't like to hang around with his neighbours. He had like the Stockwell Strangler on one side of him. So he stayed in his room a lot. And they take that as a sign that he's a psychopath because it speaks to lack of empathy, grandiosity. So only in Broadmoor would not wanting to hang out with serial killers be a sign of madness. So Anthony Maiden said, if you want to know more about psychopaths, you can go on a psychopath spotting course with Robert Hare, who invented the psychopath checklist. So I did. I went on a 3-day course, which is exactly the same as people who now are court experts who speak at sentencing hearings and so on to determine whether somebody is a high-scoring psychopath or not. I went on a 3-day course, and I am now an extremely adept psychopath spotter. Hare said to me repeatedly, he said, some guy in Broadmoor who may or may not have faked madness, that's not a big story. The big story is corporate psychopathy. He said, psychopathy is so powerful a brain anomaly, and it is a brain anomaly, he says. It's the amygdala doesn't send enough signals of fear and distress up and down to the central nervous system. Psychopaths are the neurological opposite of me. My amygdala sends way too many signals of fear and distress up and down to my central nervous system. So they don't feel anxious, no anxiety. He said, it's such a powerful brain anomaly that it moulded society all wrong. Capitalism, at its most ruthless, is a physical manifestation of psychopathy. That's how powerful the condition is. We are all victims of psychopathy. He said, you really want to try and get an interview with a corporate psychopath. So I looked around and I chose Al Dunlap. Al Dunlap in the 1990s was a very notorious asset stripper. He would come into a company and he'd fire everybody and the share prices would shoot up. He did it at Scott, which was one of America's leading toilet paper manufacturers. He came in, closed down plants all over the place. And he'd kind of fire people quite often with a quip, with like a funny joke. So one of his stories was, somebody came up to him and said, I've just bought myself a new car. And our Dunlap said, you may have a new car, but I'll tell you what you don't have, a job. One time he went to a plant in Mobile, Alabama, and asked somebody how long he'd been working there, and the guy said 30 years. And he said, why do you want to work at a place for 30 years for? It makes no sense. And then he closed the plant down and fired everybody. He said something that wasn't psychopathic, like, for instance, he said no. I didn't ask him about promiscuous sexual behaviour, because his wife was there, and frankly, I'd chickened out. But he said no to juvenile delinquency. And he said no to early behaviour problems. He said, because I got accepted into West Point, and if I was a delinquent, they wouldn't have had me in. There's no rumours of affairs. He's only been married twice. Admittedly, his first wife cited in her divorce papers that he once threatened her with a knife and said, I always wondered what human flesh tasted like. But he has only been married twice. Also, by the way, he would often speak about his wise and supportive parents, but didn't turn up to either of their funerals. But even so, there was quite a few items on the psychopath checklist that didn't apply to him at all. So I thought to myself, well, I won't put that in my book. And then I realised, my goodness, being a psychopath spotter has turned me somewhat psychopathic. I was displaying lack of empathy. I was being cunning and manipulative. And it had turned me kind of power mad. And then I got a call from Tony in Broadmoor. And he said, by the way, Tony has always denied being a psychopath. He says, the problem with the checklist, he says, one of the items is lack of remorse. Another item is cunning, manipulative, and pathological lying. So if you tell them you feel remorse for your crime, I feel enormous remorse for what I did. They say, typical of the psychopath, to pretend to be remorseful when they're not. He said it's like voodoo. They turn everything upside down. And the Hare checklist is used by experts in sentencing hearings and parole and probation hearings all the time. The rest of somebody's life can be determined on how high they score on the psychopath test. Anyway, Tony said he had a tribunal planned, and would I like to come? So I went to it. And after 14 years now in Broadmoor for a crime that would have got him 5 years if he hadn't faked madness, they let him go. And he's now out. He said to me, he said, John, so well, you've got to remember, everybody's a bit psychopathic. He said, you are, I am. Well, obviously I am. I said, what are you going to do now? He said, well, there's a woman in Belgium I fancy, but she's married. To get her divorced. But that's okay, because we're manipulative. So Tony's out and about. I spent a long time wondering, actually, what I should think about Tony. I was worried, because part of me really wanted to support him, and another part of me thought, well, he might be a psychopath, and they have a 60% recidivism rate. What do I do? So for a while I wondered whether I should write about him in a supportive way, but not quite good enough for it to actually work. So like campaign for his release, but quite badly, like a sort of crap Bono. But now I've decided, actually, is Tony a psychopath or is Tony a miscarriage of justice? And the answer I came up with is both. You could be a psychopath and you can also be a miscarriage of justice, because we should not be determined by a checklist, and we should be defined by our sanity and not our madness, if we possibly can. And sometimes it's our madness, it's the least attractive aspects of our personalities, it's our anxieties and our compulsions and our obsessions that lead us sometimes to do quite interesting things, that lead us to move forward and succeed. Thank you very much.